30 minutes. That's how long it took for a 12,500-seat stadium to disappear off the market. Not a discount session tucked into a weekday afternoon, center court, the single biggest court at the entire tournament, for a match involving a player who wasn't even supposed to be playing there in the first place. Here's the story before anything else, because this story only makes sense once you understand the sequence correctly. This sellout happened because Alex Eala's ticket demand had already outgrown the court organizers originally planned to put her on, and when they finally moved her up to the big stage, fans cleared it out before most people had even finished reading the announcement that she'd been relocated there. This wasn't even the first time it happened in Toronto. It happened again and then again until center court had sold out. So let's walk through exactly how a 21-year-old from the Philippines emptied out one of the biggest tennis venues in Canada in less time than it takes to actually watch a full set of tennis. To understand why 30 minutes is such a genuinely wild number, you have to know what the original plan actually was, because the story doesn't start with center court at all. Eala arrived in Toronto for the National Bank Open just 48 hours after winning her first WTA title in Washington. Barely enough time to process what had happened to her career, let alone rest from it. And when organizers built the schedule for her opening match against Katie McNally, they didn't put her on the main stadium. They slotted her for the grandstand, a perfectly respectable second-tier show court that seats roughly 2,800 people, the kind of assignment that made complete sense on paper for a player who, only weeks earlier, had been sitting outside the top 50 in the world rankings. Nobody was being dismissive. It was a reasonable, data-driven decision based on where her career had been just 1 month prior. Then, reality intervened, and it intervened fast. As ticket requests started pouring in for that Wednesday session, it became obvious almost immediately that 2,800 seats wasn't going to come close to covering it. Rebecca Hale, speaking directly to Tennis Channel about the situation, didn't hedge or soften what was happening. She put a real number on it. Organizers estimated Eala had already sold upwards of 5,000 tickets for that single match, nearly double what the grandstand could physically hold. A court that had seemed like a totally sensible assignment a few weeks earlier was suddenly running at less than 60% of actual demand, and the gap wasn't closing, it was widening by the day. So the tournament made the only real call available to them. They pulled her match off the grandstand entirely and moved it to center court, the primary stadium at Sobeys Stadium, seating around 12,500 people, more than 4 times the size of where she'd originally been scheduled to play. And that's where the number in the headline actually comes from. Once the move to center court was confirmed and tickets for that newly assigned session went back on sale, the entire allotment sold out in 30 minutes. Not the day. Not the afternoon. Half an hour. For a stadium more than 4 times larger than the one that had already proven insufficient just days earlier. Rebecca Hale herself, on TSN, described what she was watching in blunt terms. Unheard of. That's not hype language pulled from a highlight reel or a caption written by a social media intern trying to make a moment sound bigger than it was. That's the actual language used by someone whose entire job is forecasting ticket demand for a professional tennis tournament, describing a pattern she'd never seen before in her own building. Sit with the scale of that shift for a second, because it's easy to read past a stat like this without actually processing what it means operationally. Going from a 2,800-seat court to a 12,500-seat court isn't a minor upgrade. It's the difference between a modest afternoon crowd and one of the largest single audiences a tennis match can draw outside of a Grand Slam final. And the fact that the bigger court sold out just as fast, if not faster, than the smaller one had already proven insufficient, tells you that the true ceiling on demand hadn't even been found yet. Nobody actually knows what the real number would have been if organizers had scheduling flexibility to go even bigger. All anyone knows for certain is that every single court size they tried, Eala's fans outgrew it within minutes. And this wasn't a one-time spike that happened to catch everyone off guard on a single lucky Wednesday. According to multiple reports out of the tournament, center court sold out specifically because of her matches on 3 separate occasions during that same event. Not once, not as a fluke tied to one particular opponent or one particular night, but as a recurring pattern that kept repeating every single time she was scheduled there. That's the detail that turns this from an interesting anecdote into something closer to a structural fact about how ticket demand behaved around her that entire week. If it had happened once, you could reasonably chalk it up to a perfect storm. A good matchup, a slow news week, a lucky scheduling slot. Happening 3 times means the tournament had, in effect, stumbled onto a completely reliable predictor of when their biggest court was going to sell out. Check whether Alex Eala was playing on it. And it wasn't just her singles matches driving this either. Eala had also entered the doubles draw in Toronto, partnering with Venus Williams, a legend of the sport by any measure, someone who sold out stadiums on her own name for over 2 decades. Even that pairing's opening match ended up getting bumped into a primetime slot specifically because of the demand tied to Eala's presence in the draw. Think about what that actually says. This wasn't a case of a big-name veteran carrying a lesser-known partner into a better time slot because of her own drawing power. The scheduling decision moved in the other direction, a doubles match. Historically, one of the lower-demand draws at any tennis tournament got elevated because of the singles storyline surrounding one of its participants. That's not how tournament scheduling usually works. Doubles almost never dictates primetime placement. It did here. None of this happened in a vacuum, and it's worth connecting it directly back to where this entire pattern actually started, because Toronto wasn't an isolated incident. It was the second confirmed data point in a chain that would keep extending for the rest of the summer. Just days before any of this happened in Canada, Mark Ein, the owner of the Mubadala City DC Open in Washington, told media that roughly 80% of the ticket-related questions coming into his own box office during that tournament were some version of the exact same sentence. When is Alex Eala playing? That wasn't a stat about the tournament's overall popularity. It was a stat about an entire event's ticket inquiries reorganizing themselves around one specific player's schedule, days before she'd even won the title that made her a household name back home. So when Toronto's center court sold out in 30 minutes just a week or so later, it wasn't really a new phenomenon appearing out of nowhere. It was the same underlying demand that had already shown up in Washington, except now attached to a bigger stage, a bigger stadium, and a bigger number to prove it. The pattern didn't reset when she crossed the border into a different country. It didn't reset when she moved from a WTA 500 event to a WTA 1000. If anything, it accelerated. Washington was 80% of ticket inquiries at a mid-tier event, and Toronto was a fan base that outgrew a 12,500-seat stadium, fast enough to draw a direct quote from a tournament executive calling it something she'd never witnessed before. And she gave that Toronto crowd every reason to keep showing up rather than treating the moment like a passing curiosity that would fade the second results stopped matching the hype. 48 hours removed from the Washington Trophy, in that very first match against Katie McNally, the one that forced the move to center court in the first place, she rolled her ankle mid-match. A scare like that, especially on the back of almost zero recovery time, is exactly the kind of moment where a tired, undertrained body could reasonably shut things down rather than risk a worse injury. She didn't shut it down. She played through it and closed the match out in 3 sets. 6-3, 5-7, 6-4. Giving a stadium full of people who'd fought for tickets exactly the kind of gutsy, complete performance that justifies showing up again next time. Days later, she beat Alicia Parks, the same player who had bageled her at the Australian Open back in January, turning an old loss into a redemption storyline in front of a crowd that had specifically shown up to see exactly that kind of moment happen live. 7 straight match wins, stacked across 2 different tournaments before Belinda Bencic finally stopped the run cold in the round of 16, in a match that, notably, still drew one of those 3 sellout crowds at center court despite eventually ending in a loss. Even in defeat, the demand didn't disappear. People still filled the building to watch her play, win or lose, which tells you the crowd wasn't just chasing a winning streak, they were chasing her, specifically, regardless of how the scoreboard ended up looking. This is really the core distinction worth understanding about what happened in Toronto, because it's easy to flatten a story like this down to, she's popular right now, and move on without actually examining what that popularity is built on. Most ticket demand in professional sports is conditional. Fans show up because a favorite is expected to win, because a rivalry has real stakes attached, because a specific occasion justifies the price of admission. Take away the winning expectation, and conditional demand usually shrinks fast. Nobody rushes to buy tickets to watch a player they only cared about because of a hot streak once that hot streak cools off. What happened at center court doesn't fit that model. The crowd that sold out that stadium in 30 minutes showed up for a player who, weeks earlier, wasn't even a top 50 name. They kept showing up through an ankle scare that could have ended her tournament early. They kept showing up for the loss to Bencic that finally snapped her win streak. That's not conditional demand tracking a result. That's demand that had already detached itself from the scoreboard entirely, attaching instead to her, directly, as a reason on its own to be in the building. And once you see that distinction clearly, the Washington to Toronto connection stops looking like a coincidence and starts looking like the early shape of something much bigger. Two different countries, two different tournament tiers, two entirely different operational teams handling ticketing, neither one coordinating with the other, neither one able to see what was happening at the other event in real time. And both of them, independently, ended up describing the exact same phenomenon using almost identical language. Box office numbers reorganizing themselves around one player, court sizes proving insufficient, executives going on record calling what they were witnessing unprecedented for their own venues. That's not a marketing narrative someone constructed after the fact to make a good story sound better. That's two separate data sets, gathered independently, telling the same story from two different angles. Which is exactly why this Toronto sellout matters well beyond the 30-minute headline number itself, because taken on its own, that number would just be an eye-catching stat that gets mentioned once and forgotten. It's not just a fun fact about a fast-selling stadium, and treating it that way misses the entire point of why it happened in the first place. It's confirmation that whatever started in Washington wasn't a local phenomenon, tied to a hometown-adjacent crowd rallying around a feel-good story for one single week before the sports calendar simply moved on the way it always does. If Toronto had never happened, that explanation would have been the easy, comfortable one to reach for. A nice moment, a nice write-up, nothing more permanent than that. Instead, it traveled. It grew. It showed up in a different country, attached to a completely different fan base's ticket-buying habits, running through a completely different tournament's ticketing systems, managed by executives who had no visibility into what had already happened in Washington. And it produced results specific enough, and unusual enough, that a tournament executive felt compelled to go on television and describe what she was watching as something she'd genuinely never seen before inside her own building. People who run ticketing operations for professional tournaments see plenty of demand spikes over the course of a career. For one of them to call this unprecedented on record isn't a throwaway line. It's a professional assessment from someone whose entire job is measuring exactly this kind of thing. When a pattern repeats itself across borders, across tournament tiers, and across completely separate operational teams without losing any of its intensity along the way, that's the exact point where it stops being a story about one hot week and starts being a story about a genuine, sustained shift in how a significant fan base spends its money and its time. That's a much bigger claim than "she's popular right now," and it's a claim that only holds up because it happened twice, independently, in two different countries, at two different levels of the sports calendar. So the real question this Toronto sellout actually raises isn't about tennis at all, not directly, even if tennis is the surface it's playing out on. It's about how far this kind of demand can travel before it hits some kind of natural ceiling. Because patterns like this always hit one eventually. The only real question is where. Washington proved this could dominate a mid-tier event's entire box office, reshaping 80% of incoming ticket questions around one player's schedule. Toronto proved something even sharper. This demand could outgrow not one court size, but two, inside the same event, forcing a mid-tournament relocation that then sold out again, immediately, at a much larger capacity. It also proved this pull extends past her own singles matches, strong enough to push a doubles pairing into a prime-time slot purely because of who was standing on one side of that partnership. The obvious next question, the one that decides whether this becomes a season-defining storyline or eventually flattens back down to a normal level of attention, is what happens when this exact pattern runs into an even bigger stage, a deeper field, a longer tournament spread across 2 weeks instead of one, giving fatigue and inconsistency far more room to interrupt momentum than a shorter event ever could. A venue built to hold more people than Washington and Toronto combined, with a media spotlight neither of those tournaments comes close to matching. Because if the pattern holds there too, if the same forces that push Toronto's court change happen again, at a scale that makes Toronto look almost modest by comparison, this stops being a story about ticket sales in two cities during one unusually hot stretch. It starts looking like something durable enough to reshape how future tournaments plan their own scheduling around her, and it starts doing that well before her results alone would typically justify that kind of institutional attention from directors who have to make these venue calls months ahead of time. That's the part worth sitting with, because it flips the usual order of things almost entirely on its head. Normally, in professional sports, demand follows results with a predictable lag. A player has a big win, a signature moment, a breakthrough run, and then the following event sees a bump in ticket sales as a direct response to what everyone just watched happen. That's the standard sequence. Result first, demand second, always in that order, because fans are typically reacting to something they've already seen rather than betting on something they haven't yet. Here, the demand has repeatedly run ahead of confirmed results, and that distinction matters far more than it might initially seem. She hadn't cracked the top 20 in the world when Washington's box office reorganized itself around her schedule, with 80% of ticket inquiries collapsing onto one specific question about when she'd be playing next. At that point in the season, she was a talented player having a good tournament, not yet a proven top-tier threat with a body of results to justify that level of institutional attention from a tournament's own ticketing operation. She'd won exactly one title, a single WTA 500 trophy, her first at that level, when Toronto had to abandon its original court plan entirely and relocate her match to a stadium more than 4 times larger than what they'd initially assigned. One title. Not a sustained run of Grand Slam quarterfinals, not a top 10 ranking, not years of accumulated proof. One title, and it was already enough to force a tournament to rebuild its own scheduling infrastructure around her in real time. The demand isn't trailing the scoreboard the way it normally would. It's been running in front of it, consistently, at every single stop along the way, which leaves really only 2 honest explanations for what's actually happening here. Either this is a fan base with unusually sharp instincts about where this specific career is headed, reading the trajectory correctly before the rankings and the trophy count have fully caught up to confirm it, or it's a level of emotional investment strong enough that the actual result on the scoreboard has become almost secondary to the experience of simply being present when something happens. Both explanations are worth taking seriously, and they're not mutually exclusive. It's entirely possible fans are doing both at once, reading the signs accurately while also being emotionally invested enough that they'd show up regardless of what those signs actually said. Think about what it actually takes for a group of ticket buyers to behave this way, collectively, across 2 different countries, without any of them coordinating with each other. It requires a level of trust in a player's trajectory that most fans reserve for athletes who've already spent years proving themselves at the highest level. Usually, that kind of blind, preemptive buying only shows up around established superstars. The kind of player whose name alone guarantees a show, regardless of who they're facing or how the season has gone so far. What's unusual here is that this level of trust attached itself to someone who, by traditional metrics, hadn't yet earned it in the conventional sense. No top 10 ranking, no multi-year track record, no Grand Slam title, just a rapid string of results building on top of each other fast enough that a fan base decided the wait-and-see approach wasn't necessary anymore. And that's exactly why the next test of this pattern matters so much, because right now it's still technically possible to explain all of this away as 2 closely connected data points rather than a fully established trend. Drop your prediction for whether this exact pattern, a smaller court proving insufficient, a bigger court selling out almost instantly the moment she's moved on to it, repeats again at whatever tournament comes next on her schedule. Because if it does, and it happens a 3rd time, in a 3rd city, under a 3rd completely independent set of organizers making their own decisions without any coordination with what happened in Washington or Toronto, this stops being something you can reasonably wave off as a coincidence tied to 2 specific cities that happen to catch good timing back to back. 2 data points can be an interesting story. 3 data points, all pointing the same direction, start to look like a rule. If it happens a 3rd time, that's no longer a story about lucky timing in 2 markets. That's a fan base that's fundamentally changed how tournaments have to plan their own ticketing infrastructure the moment her name appears anywhere on a draw sheet. Regardless of her seed number, regardless of who she's been drawn to play, regardless of what round the match falls in or how far into the tournament it happens to be scheduled. That's not a minor operational detail. That's the kind of shift that changes how a tournament director approaches court assignments for an entire event, months before the actual results of that season are in, simply because ignoring the pattern has already proven costly twice in a row. Nobody wants to be the third city that gets caught flat-footed after watching the exact same thing happen somewhere else already, twice. And stick around, because the next time organizers have to make exactly this kind of last-minute court change, and if the pattern holds the way it's held so far, that's a matter of when, not if, we'll be tracking it in real time as it actually unfolds. Not after the fact, not in a recap once the story's already settled. Court size going in before anyone on the organizing side even realizes they've undersold the room. Court size coming out the moment the relocation actually gets confirmed and made public. How long that new, larger allotment actually survives once it goes back on sale, whether it's 30 minutes again or something faster or something that finally breaks the streak. And whatever final number ends up attached to it, because at the rate this has been accelerating, Washington's 80%, Toronto's 2 separate court upgrades, 3 sellouts at the same stadium in one tournament, there's a real chance whatever comes next makes Toronto's 30 minutes look slow by comparison. That's not an exaggeration for the sake of a dramatic close. That's just where the trend line is actually pointing right now, based on nothing but what's already happened, city after city, without a single instance of it slowing down. And if that happens, if the next tournament produces a number that makes this one look modest, it won't be the last time we're sitting here saying exactly that. Because at some point, this stops being a series of individual surprises and starts being the expected outcome every single time her name shows up on a schedule. So don't just take my word for when that shift happens. Watch it happen live with us, court by court, city by city, and see for yourself exactly when unheard of stops being the right word for it.